So in the reading corner today, I'm delighted to be welcoming Tony Bradman. Tony is a prolific author. I mean, who can forget Dilly the Dinosaur from way back, or Through the Window, the picture books illustrated by Eileen Brown. But recently, Tony has become very well known for his writing of historical fiction, Anglo-Saxon Boy, and in particular today, we're going to be talking about Viking Boy and Viking Boy, the Real Story. I'm really excited to be talking to you, Tony, because you're a font of knowledge.
I just do what I do, go from book to book, really. And I feel very privileged to be in the world of children's books.
And it's true, these historical stories that you've written, they've really found a place, haven't they, in the heart of teachers, I think, in particular. We're going to start a little bit by talking about your interest, I think, in the Vikings, because I read your author's note. Like so many of us, we were drawn in by the wonderful Tolkien.
Exactly. I mean, I've done a lot of kind of school visits in the last few years, Zoom visits mostly, and I always get asked, what inspired you? What do you like about the Vikings? Why did you want to do that? And I always say I had a really great teacher in my last year at primary school in a very ordinary South London state school, in Penge, called Mr. Smith, and he read us The Hobbit. And I absolutely loved it. I had been interested before, but that particular story made me want to read more. And it sort of led me to other things, and a great library up the road, and went there and borrowed The Lord of the Rings in their original hardback versions with the fold-out maps, and just absolutely loved every part of it and read all those. And of course, what I found out later was that Tolkien was Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, and was therefore an absolute expert in all things Northern European, in the sagas, the Viking myths, all of that kind of stuff. So the roots of my obsession with books, and children's books in particular, were tied up with the world of Northern European myth as kind of seen through Tolkien. Then I went to grammar school, and we did the Romans and the Saxons, and we did the Vikings. I just loved everything about it. And I watched the Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis film, The Vikings, from mid-1950s. It was just right from early days, loved the Vikings. And when I first went into children's books, I really wanted to write historical fiction. But at the time, sort of mid-late 80s, early 90s, it wasn't very fashionable. People didn't really like it. So I got sidetracked into Dilly the Dinosaur and writing beginner readers. But there was always in the back of my mind, I wanted to write longer fiction, wanted to write historical fiction. And it wasn't until, I think, after Harry Potter, and then when the curriculum changed at the beginning of the 21st century, and there was an emphasis on specific periods, one of which was Saxons and Vikings, that publishers began to get interested in historical fiction again and saw a good reason to publish fiction for those periods. And I got asked to do some shorter things. I did a little book about Boudica and various other things. And then finally, the editor I've been working with, Jill Evans, on Dilly, she went to Walker, and they were doing a series of graphic novels. They'd hired a graphic novels editor and said, have you got any good ideas for a graphic novel? And I'd had this title in my head for a while, Viking Boy. And I said, well, I'd try and devise a plot to go with it. And they said they liked it. And in 2008, they said, we'd like you to do it, commission me. And they gave me a year to do it. And it took 2 and a lot of hard work. And the rest is history, as they say.
Indeed it is.
So, oddly enough, we children's writers, I think we all feel ultimately the books we love doing are those that we would have liked to have read when we were a particular age as a child. And I just sat down to write Viking Boy, and I wanted to write a book that I would have liked to have read when I was 11.
I wonder if you could offer our listeners, in your words, a synopsis of Viking Boy, and then perhaps we can hear you read a little bit from it.
Okay. Viking Boy is a story of Gunnar, a 15-year-old who's living with his mother and father in a steading, a farm in Norway. In the Viking Age is no particular year. And a local bigwig called Skully Eyolfsson, comes to visit his dad, and there's a bit of banter, and there's definite sense that there's a problem. So to cut a long story short, Skully comes back a bit later and burns down Gunnar's longhouse, kills his dad. These are spoilers, but that's the end of chapter 2, so it's not too much of a spoiler. And Gunnar is outraged and clearly, distraught, and swears vengeance on Scully. But Scully just laughs at him because he's a man and Gunnar's a boy. And now that's where the Viking Boy title comes in, because we get a bit of fantasy. The Valkyries come to collect the body of Gunnar's father and take him to Valhalla, which enables Gunnar's mum, Helga, to help him escape, and he runs off and goes on a quest through the world of the Vikings, in which he has all sorts of problems and faces lots of challenges. And his goal is to get to Valhalla and get his dad back, so that together they can go back and revenge themselves on Scully. So it's a revenge story. And on the way, he meets some friends and acquires a longship crew. And my favourite character is Rurik, this flawed but very cool Viking who's a real force of nature. And the two bond and go off on this great adventure. So it's got travel, it's got fighting, it's got adventure, and it builds up to a big final battle, which is what all good stories should do.
Fantastic.
I'll read you a bit now. Okay, so early on, the Longhouse is attacked, and Scully's men defeat Gunnar's father and kill him. Scully, his men get hold of Gunnar and his mother Helga, and this is what happens after that. Take the woman and the boy to the front of the Longhouse, Scully said. Bring the body of his father too, so the rest can see it. Gunnar felt rough hands grab him. He kicked and fought and tried not to let go of father or the amulet on its leather thong. Two raiders pulled him away, snapping the thong and leaving the amulet clutched in Gunnar's fist. Mother was dragged away too, screaming something he couldn't make out. The Longhouse burned beyond her, red flames leaping into the sky. Gunnar and mother were thrown down. Father's body was thrown down as well. Just a few feet away from them, and Deathbringer, father's sword, was tossed on the ground beside him. The wolfmen danced and whooped and told one another how brave they had been, and Gunnar felt fury growing inside him. We'll get out of this, mother whispered. I'll think of a way to get us out of this. She hugged him, but Gunnar barely noticed. He saw the people of the farm cowering in fear. Many were wailing at the sight of father's body, and the wolfmen snapped at them like dogs snarling at sheep. Gunnar's fury grew hotter, fiercer, and he pushed father's amulet deep into the pocket of his leggings. You know, Grim, I've a good mind to make this my home for a few years, Scully said. It's a better farm than any of my others, and it won't take long to rebuild the Longhouse. Mind you, I'll need a wife to take care of it. What about it, Helga? Would you like to be a rich man's wife? Gunnar looked up. Scully was standing over them, staring down at mother, a cruel smile on his lips, Grim behind him, smirking. Mother stared back at Scully defiantly, her face pale and smudged with ashes. I am the wife of Bjorn Sigurdsson, she said, and such will I always be. Scully snorted and nodded at father's body. Well, he can't do you much good now, can he said. Marry me and you might be a queen someday. I'd rather be dead, said mother. Her eyes narrowed. She spat on Scully's boots. And I'll stick a knife in your ribs rather than let you touch me. Grim moved forward, raised his hand to strike her, and she stared at him, her eyes full of hate. But Scully grabbed Grim's arm. No, leave her, Grim, he said. She's got a right to be angry with me. After all, I have just had her husband slaughtered and seized her home. This steading will never be yours, Scully, yelled Gunnar, unable to control himself. It was my father's, and now it's mine. Ah, the son speaks, said Scully. He grabbed Gunnar and yanked him to his feet. Mother screamed, but Grim held her down. What are you going to do with the boy, Grim? Said Scully. Grim shrugged. Maybe I should adopt him. How would you like to be the son of a king boy? That would make you a prince. Murderer, yelled Gunnar, lashing out, trying to punch and kick him. I hate you. I am Gunnar, son of Bjorn Sigurdsson, and I swear on the blood of my ancestors I will take vengeance on you for the murder of my father. Scully held him at arm's length and laughed, the man's iron grip biting into the flesh of Gunnar's shoulder. You don't know what you're talking about, boy, said Scully. A blood oath isn't a thing to be taken lightly. I know that, hissed Gunnar, although he wasn't exactly sure what a blood oath involved, but saying it had certainly felt right. What a family you are, said Scully, shaking his head once more. I offer your father the chance of power and riches, and he says no thanks, he'd rather just be a farmer. I offer to make your mother a queen and you a prince, and you both threaten to kill me. Where's the gratitude? Here, Grim, you have him. Scully pushed Gunnar over to the other man. Grim threw a mail-clad arm round his throat, and Gunnar almost choked. his nostrils filling with the smell of oiled steel and old sweat. "What are you going to do?" said Mother. "Well, that's an interesting question, Helga," said Scully, smiling down at her again. "I was thinking of being nice to the lad, of making friends with him so he'd come round to the idea of marrying me. Then he went and spoiled things with that oath of his." Gunnar tried to speak, but Grim squeezed tighter, silencing him. "You can't hurt a man like you," Mother said. "He's just a boy." "Little boys grow up to be big boys," said Scully. "And I can't take the risk that he'll turn out to be as good a warrior as his father." "Don't worry, Helga. You'll have plenty more sons, I can promise you that." "Kill him, Grim." "No!" Mother screamed again, more horrified, more desperate than before. She flung herself at Grim, and 2 wolfmen grabbed her and held her down, even though she flailed and kicked and tried to bite them. Gunnar fought too, but Grim grabbed his hair and pushed him to his knees. He heard the sound from its scabbard and struggled even harder as Grim yanked his head backwards. "Hold still, you little swine," Grim snarled. Suddenly the man's grip seemed to relax, and Gunnar saw Scully looking up at the sky with a puzzled expression. Something was coming in a blaze of light and a great beating of wings.
The Valkyries and the Ravens. He was lucky not to be slaughtered. But you'd have no story without that. So
no, you wouldn't. So when I've done school sessions, I said, you could do it in all sorts of ways, but, I wanted real threat, real jeopardy. But also Scully as a character, he's quite funny. And I think when you're telling a story, it's good to do people like that, to do characters like that. They're a lot of fun to write. And when you read the kind of Viking sources, the Icelandic sagas, it's full of people like that. Fantastic characters, who are absolutely vile. They're violent killers, but they're quite funny. So I wanted to get that into the stories as well.
I did want to ask you, because you are an advocate of using historical fiction to enhance children's understanding of history and the teaching of history. So I've got a 2-part question, really. Should we use historical fiction in that way? And what are the pitfalls?
I think, yes. I think it's very good to use historical fiction. I think, actually, if you talk to a lot of writers, a lot of historians, actually, will tell you that they were first really inspired to become interested in history by reading a very great historical story. Of course, historical fiction is full of imagination. We don't know everything about periods in the past, and you fill the gaps with your imagination. And part of what historical fiction, the best historical fiction does, is it tries to give you a sense of what it might have felt like. So to create characters who are within that world and you're inside their heads. So it is great. And I think for schools particularly, and particularly for primary age children, bringing a period to life with a really good historical story is a really good way to get into it. So long as you're doing the history, the story as well kind of adds to it. And I would always say the word history, it's got the word story in it, and its derivation, historia, through Latin from Greek, Aristotle's Historia, story is in the roots of history, and narrative history has always been about telling stories about characters and people and biography. So there's a huge amount of overlap between all of that. The pitfalls, if you don't use good stories, if the books you're using aren't very good, then you can get a false view of history. Classic things to get wrong are dialogue. You get kind of Tudor characters turning around to them saying, "No way am I going down there." Yeah, that's very easy, but it's sometimes it's about the way people thought about the world. I mean, in Viking Boy is full of stuff about fate, the Viking view of fate. Your fate was decided when you were born, but you don't know what it's going to be, so you might as well just get on with things. But they had a particular view of fate. Writing about periods where society was very Christian, you have a different view about sin and redemption and quality of this life as opposed to the life eternal. So really good writers of historical fiction understand that and get it across. Bernard Cornwell's Last Kingdom series, which has been adapted, it's not for kids, but it's absolutely brilliant. Incredible. The books are fantastic explorations of what it must have felt like to be in that period, in the century of Alfred the Great, and the Viking invasions. Others I've read, I thought, no, just doesn't work for me. So if you're going to use them in schools as a teacher, you really need to be pretty much on your game to make sure you pick the best ones. That said, it's constantly changing. So history is a living thing. So you really need to look at what you're using and assess it in that way. But actually part of learning about history for kids as well is that there are different views of things. And I think the best teaching in primary schools uses that and builds on it. The historical fiction that I would always go back to when I was growing up was Robert Graves' I, Claudius books. Mary Renault, I would go back to Mary Renault's historical fiction, which was terrific. Children's historical fiction, Rosemary Sutcliffe. To this day, there are some of her books I think are absolutely superb. My favourite is The Eagle of the Ninth, which has that kind of, imperial feel to it. There's a book called Dawn Wind, which is about the Anglo-Saxon period, which is absolutely superb. So there are some wonderful things you can use, and I do think they really do enhance history teaching. But I'm very aware of that, so I'm very keen when I do books to try and make them absolutely as accurate as possible. I really do go overboard with the research.
And also in writing fiction, you're concerned with the point of view of your character. You can't necessarily bring in all points of view and have a good piece of fiction, can you?
You can't. No, you can't. And actually, I talk to kids about it. That exposition, getting the historical background in is really hard. Because I wrote a lot of comedy, for younger kids, a lot of funny stories. And I always used to say, these people who write sort of deadly serious, issue-driven contemporary novels, it's dead easy, all that, you just, off you go. If you want to write a contemporary novel that's funny, not only have to do all the things that the serious novelist does with character, plot, and everything else, you have to make it funny as well. Comedy is really hard. Life is hard, comedy is harder.
Which brings us nicely to thinking about non-fiction and Viking Boy, the Real Story, which is subtitled Everything You Need to Know About the Vikings.
That's right.
Did the thought from accompanying non-fiction book come from you, the publisher, or was it from teachers who'd been using Viking Boy in history lessons?
Well, it was kind of me, really. Viking Boy had done really well, so they asked me to write Anglo-Saxon Boy a few years later, and it did really well in schools again. I just said to Walker, I'd love to do another book, I did have this idea for a non-fiction book about the Vikings that looked at specific Viking objects, because there's kind of key elements like a sword, a long ship, the longhouse. So those there would be ways into understanding Viking culture. And I did a lot of research. And when I was writing, I went to Norway, to the Viking Ship Museum just outside Oslo. And then I went to the one in Denmark, in Roskilde. And I just obsessively read about the Vikings, tried to learn Old Norse, and the language and read the sagas. And I did an outline and I did a sample. And it was okay. And then one of the editors there, Denise Johnson-Burt, she said, well, why don't you use Gunnar, the narrator of Viking Boy, as the narrator of the non-fiction book? So it would be kind of Gunnar explaining his life and culture and everything. I thought it was a great idea, because if you used a fictional character, you could actually do a bit of storytelling and make it lively and funny and interesting. So Gunnar speaks, talks about farming and the land and people and what men and differences between men and women and growing up as a child and warriors and religion. But then there are straight non-fiction bits as well. Lots of fantastic illustration by a guy called Tom Sperling. And I say the subtitle is Everything You Need to Know About the Vikings, that will tell you what they were like. So it's as much about the culture, and their view of the world. So about fate and the darkness at the heart of Viking religion. And Viking warrior culture particularly is very dark. It is, like a death cult. When a Viking warrior signed up to go on a voyage, he gave his loyalty to a chief. Part of the deal is if the leader dies, we die too. We all go together. And the leader would say, well, you've done that for me and I will be a ring giver. I will make sure I bring you wealth and glory. And I don't think that's really covered in a lot of the stuff kids learn about the Vikings. We learn about them raiding things, but that's what's there. And that's why they were so incredible as warriors, and because they were this incredible kind of violent death cult. And also there's all the other stuff that we don't cover, like how they went east as well as west. So they founded Russia. Rus is what the locals, particularly the Finns, called the Vikings in those lands. And it means, probably comes from a Finnish word meaning people who row a boat, because they went down the big rivers. So I thought I wanted to put all of that in, and we worked out a format so that we could get all of that and then have that story. And it's Gunnar speaking, so he kind of introduces it, and in a really Viking way. And so it's got some of the other characters from Viking Boy. So Scully makes an appearance. So I wanted for primary schools, particularly, to cover as wide a range as possible about the Vikings and Viking culture, so you get a sense of them as a culture and what was important to them. And yeah, they were very dark as well. I mean, there's the whole stuff about Viking slavery. They were inveterate slavers. They always took slaves, and there were big slave markets in Dublin, in Hedeby, in Denmark. And they've, found shackles, were just like the slaves in the States and the Caribbean. And I think that's an interesting thing for kids as well. Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing, the settlement of Iceland is amazing, because it was probably empty except for maybe some Irish monks who discovered it. And they settled it, and mostly people from Norway, and built these amazing farms. And the sagas are all about that, the Icelandic sagas. But probably, when they did the DNA testing, they found that a lot of the early settlers were Viking men and Irish and Scottish and English slave girls. So the original, 60-70% of the women in Iceland had been captured and then brought there and made slave girls, who were then, slaves of Viking men, who then had children with them.
Our dominant narrative is about this very male-centered society, very set roles for men and women. But excavation, DNA, document analysis are showing us other stories as well.
Yeah, they are.
Nuanced stories that often don't get into that main narrative.
Yeah. Well, Viking women are a case in point, actually. They were very independent. Viking girls did marry quite young, probably 12, 13, 14, but they could divorce their husbands for bad treatment, and they would get their dowry back. They were very tough. I mean, Icelandic sagas are full of tough women. I mean, I put an epigraph in the book. It's about the saga of Gisli Sursen. At one point, he's chased by people he's feuding with. They run up a hill with his wife. She stands behind him. They're back to back, and he looks over his shoulder at one point, and she's spitted one of his enemies on a spear. And he looks over and he says, "I always knew I'd married well, but it's only till now that I realised quite how well." These are incredible people. And I'm not, it was a patriarchal society, and women were, they weren't equal in the sense that, we want them to be. They did have more power, more freedom, more independence. But during the Middle Ages, during the medieval Christian period, then, it's kind of completely the other way. So that's interesting as well, because you see, it's not, that 19th century idea of historical progress. It's getting better all the time. No, it goes like that. In all sorts of ways. So sometimes there's freedom, sometimes there's not. So whatever you've got now, you might want to protect, because you don't know what's coming down the line.
Exactly so.
I think, trying to get a sense of that in the book, so that with good teachers, and they're all good, but teachers can look at that and pick different things out and build different lessons on different aspects of the culture.
I do want to ask you something specific about the way in which the book is written. We've got more than one voice here. We've got the first person voice of Gunnar, and then we have this third person exposition. Now, I understand why you need that, actually. And I don't know whether that was something you knew right from the beginning, or whether in writing in the first person you realised, actually, I've got to have some third person here.
Well, yeah, it's a very good question, Nikki. I mean, it was a technical issue for a writer. The first versions of the book I wrote were just straight nonfiction, I'm a decent writer, I can do that. Didn't really have a lot of life. So then the suggestion about using a character. So I thought about that, and I thought, because in Viking Boy, it's third person. We see the world. It's third person, but actually just through Gunnar, that kind of free indirect style, as we call it in fictional terms, technical terms, or through Gunnar. So it's all Gunnar, but it's third person. But I thought actually making it first person would make it more lively, bring it more to life. And it was easier to do it that way, and actually to have Gunnar's voice on there. And then when the other characters appear, like Rurik and Gunnar's dad, then it's easier because then you can have them talking directly. So the model really was kind of like a TV program where you have a character who steps up to camera and says, I am Gunnar, a young Viking boy. This is where I live. And then he looks around and then you see it. And then you might have a voiceover that says, yeah, Viking Longhouse was this, and this. So that was the kind of technical model, but it did seem to work. But then, of course, what happens then, it's a nightmare for design because not only have you got kind of first person, third person, it's sort of semi-fictional, but non-fiction. Then I'm saying, well, I want a picture of this here, and I want a map, and I want this, and then you have this. And then we wanted little kind of like chronologies, and it was a nightmare. It took a long time.
Just to round us off, Tony, I must ask you whether you're going to do the same with Anglo-Saxon Boy. Are we going to get a non-fiction accompaniment?
I would love to. I talked to Walker before Christmas, and their answer is a very published answer. Let's see how Viking Boy, the real story does. I hope it does well, because I would love to do a book about the Anglo-Saxons. It would be a little bit more of a challenge, I think, because the Viking age is about 300 years. The Saxon age really, it's about 600 years, from the end of the Roman Empire to the Norman conquest. It's big, there's lots of stuff in there. Christianity, rise of monasteries, politics, growth of England, relationships with Scotland, Wales, Ireland. I would love to do it because I think actually teachers and scholars do their best on history, but I'm still not sure we teach British history well. There are vast swathes of British history that are completely ignored in the curriculum, and I think that's wrong. So if I did do a book about the Anglo-Saxons, a chunk of it would be about the relations between the Britons who spoke Welsh and the Anglo-Saxons. The old story was that they said the Anglo-Saxons just arrived and wiped most of the Welsh out and pushed the remainder back to Wales. Current theories are more that actually a lot of Britons stayed and were ruled by Saxons and kind of bred into the population. So that idea of a warrior elite, and the locals were probably British. So our DNA mix, all that kind of pure English, that's a load of rubbish. We're all a real mix. So I'd want to explore issues like that. It would be a tricky book to do, and it would have to be a bit longer, I think. But fingers crossed. And I would quite like to do a Roman book. So we'd have Viking Boy, Anglo-Saxon Boy, and Roman Boy. Brilliant.
Well, I'm sure that Viking Boy, the real story, is going to do very well, Tony. And thank you so much for joining me in the Reading Corner.
And thank you, Nikki. It's been great.
In the Reading Corner is presented by Nikki Gamble and produced by Alison Hughes. This episode is generously sponsored by Walker Books. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review. If you would like to find out about other events and courses, visit justimagine.co.uk. Join us again in the Reading Corner on your favourite podcast platform.